One of the most important concepts in PUP is the idea of actions. And actions, the name kind of sounds scary. It sounds like it's something that involves maybe a bunch of packages or some crazy system. But in reality, actions are just a way to organize JavaScript code. They're not anything special beyond that. And the way that actions came about in PUP is actually years and years of my own work writing software. So for the past few years, I've built applications for myself and for clients and for friends. And every single time I was sitting down to do it, I noticed that for bigger and bigger applications, I would have trouble with organizing multi-step processes. That's the best phrase I could come up with for it. And these are things where I literally have to do multiple steps in one function. So, for example, a sign-up process for an application may, create a user account in the application, but it also may need to do things like create a repo on GitHub or track the user in some third-party tracking system. Something that just involves multiple steps, all kind of grouped together into one big function. And the thing that I started to realize was that, well, as I wrote this code, it would work, but it was next to impossible to debug, or it took a lot more time than it should have to debug. What I mean by that is I would have one function, so for a process, we'll say a sign-up process, where I would have anywhere from 50 to 100 lines of code. And that code would work, and step by step, it would, check off each box. It would say, like, okay, sign up the account, create the repo on GitHub, whatever was happening. But there's a lot of code involved in that. And what I started to notice is that the bigger the processes grew, the harder it was to find out when something went wrong. And so I found some tricks, like you can use try-catch blocks, which we'll see in a little bit here. But they weren't the most robust thing. And I noticed that errors became more of a problem in my applications, and it was just a struggle to try and write code. So actions are the current solution to this problem. And actions are built around a basic concept of breaking up steps or breaking up a process into multiple functions, and specifically functions that are relatively small in size, meaning they're only 5 to 10 lines of code each. And each function is given a very, very clear name as to what it's doing. So we're not ripping vowels out of the names of our functions or other ways of trying to be clever with code. We're simply saying, okay, this is exactly what this thing is doing. So when we come back to it months and months later or years later, depending on how much maintenance work we're doing on our application, we can start to put together the pieces. So I like to think of code as just a gigantic puzzle. And the code that we're writing or the functions that we're writing are the puzzle pieces. And so those pieces need to be very clear about how they fit into the bigger puzzle. Because if they're not, we can end up wasting a lot of time tracking down code, when just giving it a clear name in the first place is the thing that, we know exactly what it does. It's like, oh, okay. So in PUP, one of the features that relies on actions, actually it's the only feature currently that relies on actions, is the edit profile screen. So this is the screen for a logged in user. They go up here in the little drop down, they click on profile, and they can change things like their name, email address, and their password. And while this isn't a terribly complex process, it involves just enough steps where it's helpful to wrap this in an action so you can see the pattern and get a feel for it. And so if we take a look at this feature, what's going on here is that we have this user, Bill Murray, with the email bill@test.com. And what we're going to do is try and change the name. And so we're not going to look at the code just yet. We're just going to show what the end result of this is. And then we'll step through the code and see, okay, how do we even get to this point? How do we get this to work? So we'll just do something silly. We'll say Bill Z, got my caps lock key on, so there we go. So we'll say Murray's, and then we'll change this to Bill plus hello@test.com. Now we're going to save this. And you can see it briefly jumped in. And this is the cool part about Meteor's reactivity, is that it automatically updated. So we've got Bill's, Murray's, and now Bill plus hello@test.com. Remember before this was bill@test.com. So if we log out and then try and log back in, we're going to say bill@test.com. And we didn't change the password this time, and I set this up beforehand. and the password is just password. So we'll try and log in. We'll see user not found. So if we go back and we say hello, same password, we can get back in. So what that is trying to demonstrate is that we changed the first name, last name, and the email address, and they all updated behind the scenes for us. And we didn't change the password, so we can even do that now. So current password is password, and we'll change this to password 123. We save that. And so now it seems like nothing has happened, but if we go back again, never, just so we can show this off. So we're going to say bill plus hello@test.com. And then if I do password, we should get an error. Incorrect password, good. But if I add 1, 2, 3 on the end of that, we get in. So that confirms that our edit profile feature works, but it's not entirely clear how it's working. So if we jump over to Adam here, what we want to do is start on the client side, meaning this form that we were just playing with, we want to see like, okay, where does the code actually come into play? And so where it kicks off is in the handle submit process for the edit profile form. So if we jump down here, we can see we've got all of the fields that make up our profile, and then we've got our form with the ref right here. And the actual edit form process, the handle submit process rather, is kicked off by our validation. So our client-side validation that says, okay, we need first name and last name, email address, and if they do type in a current password, then we also require them to give us a new password. But the validation down here toward the bottom, we can see has a submit handler. And what this is doing is as soon as our submission process is complete, we call to this component.handleSubmit. And component here is just pointing to this, meaning the component instance in React. And so if we go and we find handle submit, we can see that we scoop up the email address and the profile first. And then we check, okay, does the new password have a value? Okay, it does. We go ahead and scoop all of that up, adding it and assigning it to this profile object up here. And then we go ahead and we pass that up to the server. And so this is where we start to get into actions. That stuff is mostly not important to know right now. What's important to know is that, okay, we're collecting all of this data and then we send it up to the server using a Meteor method called users.editProfile. If we jump up to the server, I have this opened up and we can see that users.editProfile takes in that profile object that we passed. And so if we jump back to the client real quick, what we're referring to is this object and potentially this object with an additional password field being assigned here if it exists. So only if the user typed in a password. So we get that object, and up here we're saying, make sure that this is what we expect. But then we get into this interesting thing. So technically speaking, we could do the entire update of the account and password right here in our method, which wouldn't be a problem. There's nothing wrong with that. But because this involves multiple steps and we want to show off how actions work, we can wrap this into what we've defined here as an edit profile action. And when we say actions, the preference is toward defining these using something known as JavaScript promises. And so promises are functions that can tell when a callback needs to fire. So in most JavaScript programs, we have the concept of asynchronous code where we call a function and then it has a callback function assigned to it so that after that process completes, we get a response. So we can say if there's an error or if there's like an actual positive response, then we'll do something after that. And those are good, but they kind of turn into something called callback hell, where you start nesting all of these callback functions to the point where you just have like essentially a pyramid of functions, which isn't terribly fun to manage and deal with. And so the official solution for this, and when we say official, this is actually in the latest JavaScript specification. So I believe this popped up in the ES 2015 specification or ES6, JavaScript 6 specification, and that's promises. So promises allow us to wrap a chunk of code that uses a callback or relies on some sort of callback, but then control when we actually want that function to return. And so it's basically the exact same callback pattern, but we can make it a little more synchronous in behavior meaning we literally can say, okay, at this point, we're done with whatever we're doing. Go ahead, and the process is known as resolving. So resolve the promise with whatever the end result of this function is. So in a multi-step process, they're really helpful to use because they make it easy for us to call multiple steps and then say that we're done. It's not where with async code we have to worry about, we call a function and then if we need some result from it, we're not having to like jumble all of these callback functions to get the result. We just call everything in sequence, and when it's done, and we can say explicitly when it's done. And so this edit profile action that we've defined is using a promise, and we can tell because we have this concept of .then and .catch. And so .then is what's going to happen when our promise, or in this case our action, is resolved. So as soon as we get a response, we're just going to return it directly from this internal function. And notice that we're returning this directly. And the reason we do this is so that the return value from here will pop out here and be returned from our method. And we'll see why that's important in a little bit. But then we also have this catch method. And the catch method takes in some exception that was thrown. So this is when an error happens, we grab that error. And then instead of returning the error, we throw it. So we use new meteor.error. And this is just a Meteor convention for throwing errors in your code. And all we're saying is throw the new meteor error, passing in whatever exception was thrown. And because we're returning the entirety of our action, or in this case, our promise, back to the client, our error will get back to the client as well as our response. And if we jump back to the client, we can see here, error here, and error.reason. So the alert that's going out to users is actually coming from right here. And we'll see why this is important relatively soon here, because we're able to, from within our action, alert at any stage in the process if something went wrong and get that message back to the client. And if you've ever worked with callbacks, you'll know that this is a serious pain in the butt, because callbacks basically trap code inside of that callback function. There's no way for us to, without a lot of difficult stuff, to get some response or some error value outside of that callback. But promises make that really easy. So let's take a look. So over here we have our edit profile action. And the edit profile action, again, is based on a JavaScript promise. And we can see down here that we export a default function. So we have our function, and here we're just using ES 2015 shorthand. So this is just removing a lot of braces and stuff like that, so we don't have to use those. But just know that whenever we see the arrow, that means, okay, we're opening a new function. So that would be something like, so we called this, we'll just say some function equals, kind of like this. So we've got our arguments, if there are any, the arrow denoting the start of our function, and then the braces containing the body of our function. But in this case, we're doing something known as an implicit return. And an implicit return just means that the only thing we're doing inside of this function is immediately returning something. So for example, if we were to do return, I'll say 1 plus 3. So we want to get 4 back. You'll notice my linter here is picking this up. It's saying like, you don't need to do this. And that's because an implicit return is better here, because all we're doing is returning a value. We're not doing any extra work. So if I was to say like, let's add numbers, it's kind of a silly variable to define, but we'll say add number and then return add number. Okay, now we're doing more than just returning a value. So you notice stuff starts or stops lighting up. So if we back up here and go back to this, an implicit return just means, okay, all we're doing is returning. So we can cut out all of the arrows and semicolons and all that stuff and just return whatever that return value would be. And so that's what we're doing down here. We're simply saying, okay, we want to return a promise, and that promise is going to give us access to a resolve and a reject method. And so resolve is what happens when our promise is successful. So our code ran as expected, and we want to resolve it or complete the promise. And reject is what happens when it fails. So something goes wrong, and we want to say, hey, wait a minute, pump the brakes, let's stop and not do this. And so what we're doing here is we're wrapping this promise in a function that we can call. So we mean by that is edit profile here is the function that we're wrapping our promise in. You'll notice we pass an object here with the user ID and that profile data we sent up from the client. And so we take in that data, those values as options, and then down here we call a function within this file, editprofile.js, called editProfile. And we can see that defined just above our main export down here. So the idea is that all we're doing is creating a little bit of structure around how our code is going to function. So instead of us writing this promise declaration every single time we want to use it inside of our method code, we just write it in here and reuse it each time. So in this case, we're saying take in the options and then define a promise. And then inside of that promise, we're wrapping the code that we want to basically kick off or start the process. So you'll notice that up here we use this keyword handler. There's nothing special about that. It's just a name that we came up with to classify what this thing is. And we say this is the handler function, meaning it handles the overall process for our action. And so what we're doing with that is we're saying, okay, call the handler, passing in the options we received. Again, the options are what we have right here. So take in those options and then combine that with a second argument that's an object set to, and this is the cool part, is we're taking the resolve and reject arguments that we get, combining them into one object. So effectively what we're getting here, if we look up in the signature for our edit profile function, again, this is the one we call down here, and we pass options and resolve reject to, we can see that up here we're using ES 2015 destructuring, which is just a way to expand or pluck apart an object just so we can get some of the properties on that object as variables. So instead of having to say something like options, and then we have to do, in this case, options.userid, we can just say, well, all we care about on that object right now is user ID and profile. So now we have access to user ID, and we can use that directly. So that's what we're doing here. But then over here, we've got promise. And so promise is literally this object that we're passing here with the resolve and reject methods defined on it. And what we do with that is really neat. And this is what makes actions more or less, is that we're taking this variable action and we're setting it equal to promise. And now we don't see action, but if we scroll up, okay, here we go. We're assigning action up here as an empty variable at the top of our file, meaning this variable action is scoped to the entire file. And in turn, every function, every piece of code in this file now has access to whatever action's value is. And so by assigning action down here to our promise, what we're doing is we're making our promise, resolve and reject, accessible to the entire file. So all of the functions, all of the code you see in here have access to our reject and resolve methods via the action variable. So action.reject you can see here, and action.resolve down here. And so that's really neat because it means that we don't have to pass manually resolve and reject with each function. So if, for example, update user, we don't have to say like promise, dot reject, promise, dot resolve. We don't have to do any of that. We're just automatically getting access to it because it's scoped thanks to our variable up here, action, to the entire file, which is cool. And so that's the basic structure of an action. That's the kickoff process. Is we define a promise, and then we call this handler function. And then the handler function is responsible for basically handling all of the steps that make up our action. And what we mean by that, and we can see this here, is we define steps as individual functions. And so again, the edit profile process isn't that complicated, and technically speaking, doesn't need to be an action, but it was the one example in PUP that really was a good candidate for showing this off. And so again, edit profile or editing a profile involves two discrete steps. It involves updating the user as well as setting their password if we had a password. And so what we can see is we've got two separate functions, even though the code we're wrapping in those functions is one function onto its own. So technically we're adding quite a bit of code here, but the point is that it's not about the amount of code that we're adding, it's the amount of clarity that we're adding. And so we can see here that, okay, what are we doing for a given step? We're updating the password in this function. In this one, we're updating the user. But again, these are just functions. There's nothing special about these other than two things. The names, so update password and update user, or say that backwards, update user, update password. And inside, we use a try-catch block. And so try-catch blocks are just a way to say, try this code, and if something goes wrong in any of that code, meaning the code inside of the try block, catch whatever exception is thrown, and then do something with that exception. And so what we're able to do inside of an action, because remember we have access to this action variable with the resolve and reject, is say, okay, go ahead and try this code, but if something goes wrong, catch whatever went wrong, and then we can get this back out to the client by saying action.reject. So effectively, we're rejecting our promise. And so let's follow this trail. So if something goes wrong in update user, we get the error here, and then we're passing it to action.reject. And you'll notice this is just a convention from us. We like to put the name where the error is occurring first in brackets, and then we pass the exception. So we do this as one big string. That way, as the developers, we know if something went wrong in our code, we know exactly where to go find it. We're not guessing. And sometimes in really, really big actions, you can even do stuff like do like a colon and then L26 to say like line 26 is exactly where this error is being thrown. But typically just knowing that like, okay, action.reject, okay, the edit profile action and the update user method or function is where this failed, and then here's the error that happened. It makes it super easy to debug. And that's just part one. The other reason this makes it really easy to debug is if we look at action.reject, well, we're passing that back up, and our reject method is here in our promise. And remember, back in our method, if we reject our promise, it's going to spit out its error here in this catch block. So we can see exception. We're just going to spit exception out here. And so what's going to happen? So we take this exception and we pass it to throw new meteor error, which in turn bubbles all the way back to the client. And so that same exact error back here, so if something goes wrong in edit profile, or actually we were using update user, so if something goes wrong in update user, we take that exception, this whole string, and we come back here, and it pops out here, goes to here, and then this gets sent all the way back to the client, meaning the user can see it. And so depending on the nature of your application, you may not want your users seeing this much detail. You may not want them to know this sort of stuff, but I actually think it's helpful because if something goes wrong for a customer or user, it's generally speaking, and I'm sure we've all run into this, an error gets thrown that's totally ambiguous. We don't know what the heck it's talking about. It says something to the effect of like, error fault 100, ... and there's no instructions as to what to do or no guidance for the user. But with this, they can tell us, oh, well, it said something about edit profile, updating the user, cannot find user with that ID. You know, something to that effect. That won't be the exact error, but it at least gives sort of a hint both to the user and to us as to where things are going wrong. And so because we have the power of a promise to help us get this error message back out, it's really, really helpful both in the development process when we're debugging stuff, as well as in production when a user runs into an error and we have to figure out what it was. We're not wasting hours and hours scrambling. It's like, oh, literally it came from edit profile.update user. So it's really sensible to use this sort of structure because it basically points a flashlight at problems in your application. It makes it way easier to fix things. And so that's pretty much it. We can see here that it's just the concept of setting a variable that's scoped to your file and assigning a promise back to that variable, and then breaking your code up into individual functions with a really descriptive name. So update user. In this case, again, the edit profile is pretty simplistic, so it's not this crazy amount of code. But if we were doing something like, oh, I don't know, creating a repository on GitHub and then adding collaborators to that repository on GitHub through their API, this code is going to get way more complicated and it would be helpful. So we'll just use our imagination right now and we'll say we're creating a repo on GitHub. It's like, if we just said GitHub repo, it's kind of like, what does that mean? And that may make sense in the moment, but typically speaking, you're going to look at that later and be like, what the hell was I thinking? Why GitHub repo? Whereas it's a bit longer, but it tells us exactly what it's doing. So create repo on GitHub. And so we know exactly what this function is doing. And most importantly, and this is kind of part of the whole pattern, is that this one function is only doing that one thing. So it's only calling the code to create a repo on GitHub. It's not creating a repo on GitHub, adding the collaborator, and making a sandwich. It's literally just creating the repo on GitHub, and then it's returning whatever that response is. But here, a little more simplified, we're just saying, okay, all we want to do is update this one user, matching the user ID that we pass, and set their email address and profile, and that's it. We're done. And so we can see down here, we're just doing this in steps. So we say the first step we want to perform is update user. And then we check. So we say, does the profile have a password? Oh, it does. Okay. We want to say if profile password, call this update password function. And then up here, we can see what we're doing is we're setting the password that counts to us, setting password, and then we're done. And so we follow this chain of functions. So we call each function all the way down until we're finished. And then we call action.resolve. And what's interesting about this is even though we're calling action.resolve in this case inside of our handler, technically speaking, we can call this from anywhere inside of this file, which is super helpful when we're dependent on some sort of return value from, this function that's being called way down the chain. So for example, if for some reason, instead of account set password here, we were, we were creating, we'll say creating a repo on GitHub, and we expected GitHub to give us a repo ID back that we needed. So again, use your imagination here. So say repo ID. So if this was returning a repo ID, we could get that response here and resolve it in our module. And then if for some reason we needed that back on the client, we could send it all the way back. Again, if we resolve a module, we're going to have the response pop out here and get tossed back to the client. We're not defining it here, but technically it would be right here. It would come out. And yeah, we could use that. So it's really, really handy. And you can use this anywhere. So let's go ahead and take that back out. And we're not really creating a repo ID, so let's get rid of that. And you'll notice I've got some code commented out here just to show off the power of this. And so what we're doing is inside of the update password, I like to call these methods. You can call them functions. The names are interchangeable. But inside of the update password method, we have this throw new meteor error. So we're trying to throw an error, simulate an error happening when we set our password. Now, this isn't actually happening. This is just a demo, but it's to show that, or it's showing what happens when an error occurs inside of this try block. And so you'll notice here we're just setting the error code, in this case just a 500 or an internal server error, and then we're passing a message that we want to get back to the client. And in this case, this is all going to pop out right here. So whatever we throw here is going to spit out here, and then this is actually going to transport that error back to the client. So if we go ahead and save this, and then jump back to our browser, we're going to go to our profile. And this is really neat. So notice I'm going to change, even though we're trying to throw this error in the password, I'm going to change a few things here. So I'm going to change the first and last name. We'll leave the email address alone, but then I'm going to try and change the password. So remember earlier we set this as password 123. So now we're going to try and change it back to password. But what we want to pay attention to is what happens. So if I click save, notice we get this nice error telling us exactly where the error occurred. So if we do that again, edit profile.update password error testing failures. And one more time, just make sure we see the whole thing. Error testing failures, and then we even get the error code that we passed. And so even though this code is nested way, way within our code, so mind you, we're going all the way from here up to our method and then into this module. And this is like the very last step where something could go wrong. We're still getting the error back. We don't have to deal with callbacks or any craziness. We're like actually getting the error that we would want. This is really helpful. And if you've ever wasted time debugging errors inside of callbacks, you're probably, like throwing your hands up in the air right now. This is amazing. And it is. It's probably one of the best things that I've personally ever come across in programming in terms of keeping code organized. Now, if you were paying attention, you probably noticed that we changed our first and last name from Bill's Murray's to Bill Murray again. And notice, it actually worked. So the steps that we're able to complete up until the point of failure succeeded. So we were able to run our code up until that point, and then the error occurred. So it's not as though if one card falls, the whole house of cards falls. It's literally when that one card falls, that's when we throw the error and stop the process. And so that's it. But it's very helpful to understand this pattern, because as you can see, it makes getting back errors super, super easy, and it makes your code a heck of a lot more organized. So it's a lot of benefits rolled into one pattern, but just a way to make your life easier. And before we part ways, it's important to note that this is a judgment call. So like I said earlier, technically speaking, this edit profile process doesn't need to be an action necessarily, because we've got one function here, two functions here. We could technically run these directly inside of our method, and it wouldn't be that messy. But as your code starts to expand and has more and more lines, you may want to consider this, and especially if that code is potentially error prone. That really comes up when you're working with third-party services or anything that's not immediately in your application. You're going to want something like this, because it's really difficult to debug later, and it can make for kind of a crappy experience for your users if your code is failing and there's no messages, there's no feedback to the user to know what's going wrong when. So from my perspective, 2 thumbs up for actions, because these are a huge boon for developers, both in the development process and in production, for figuring out errors while also keeping your code super tidy so you can come back to it later and say like, oh, what was I doing 6 months ago? Oh, I was updating the user and I was updating the password. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments.